Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome to Huddlin with the Pros Sports Talk Radio with David Weinstein. We air live every Wednesday evening at 9 p.m. Eastern. I'm David Weinstein. By day, I practice criminal defense law in Miami, Florida, with Clark Silverglade, PA. But on Wednesday nights, I'm Huddlin with the Pros legal analyst and your host for the evening. Tonight, I'll be speaking with marketing director and sharing economy advocate C.J. Todd about the sharing economy and youth sports. Well, let's take a look at something that very few of us really think long and hard about, but that it really plays a lot into how young people today can be active and can play sports. I'm joined now by C.J. Todd. C.J. is a marketing director at Stoke Share and Near Me, a sharing economy advocate, and he's going to be working on his master's thesis project at the University of San Francisco this coming September. C.J., thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
So, C.J., the first thing I want to ask you about, I think we can all agree that sports in childhood is an essential building block for a variety of benefits that continue well into adulthood. Teaches you how to play well with others, problem solving, physical exertion and activity. But part of the problem is that not all children of all different socioeconomic backgrounds can sort of benefit from that. You're starting to explore a way to bring all these benefits for kids together. Before we launch off into this, what is the sharing economy for those who aren't familiar with it, and how can that be a positive influence on youth sports?
Yeah, so the sharing economy is a new economic model that allows people to access underutilized assets that are owned by someone else. So just imagine, you have a weed whacker in your garage and it's collecting dust. Instead of letting it sit unused, rent it to your neighbor to get some extra cash. And, you're saving Tom a trip down to Lowe's and a hefty bill, for something that would just collect dust in his garage. So instead of, this consumption model that we're so used to of, having two weed whackers sitting collecting dust, only one's going to be being used effectively. And I really think that this kind of model of making use of underutilized assets can really help kids access sports more because, just imagine, I grew up and I had loads of gear and uniforms and cleats just kind of sitting around because I didn't have anybody to secondhand pass it down to. So that's kind of where I'm approaching this problem of youth sports accessibility, and especially with low-income kids, and giving them more access to youth sports.
How was it that youth sports have become so expensive to participate in? I'm not that old, and I'm sure a lot of people remember, you get the neighborhood together, somebody had a ball, somebody had a bat, everybody had a glove, and you just go out and play. That doesn't seem to be more expensive, but I think that the organized sports are more expensive, and that seems to be the way that kids are feeding into high school, college sports, and from there into professionals. How did we let it get so out of hand, something that's really sort of a child's game?
Sure. So I think it all really comes down to the way that professional sports are disseminating their media and marketing and carrying out these really, highly funded ad campaigns targeted at kids and high-level development, because we've kind of seen a cultural shift away from that free play, away from, those sandlot pickup games, and more of a intensive kind of valuation of, becoming the next Derek Jeter, becoming the next Kobe Bryant, and that's what parents, I think, are really valuing, and they're getting their kids involved in these expensive sports earlier. Parents are, going without for themselves to give their kids a bigger advantage, and, this is all, I think, driving towards getting college scholarships. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the families that can't afford or can afford very little or, can't afford any at all. And, a really cheap substitute is, video game. Like I can buy one video game for my kid and they can sit at home and play that video game over and over and over. And, opposed to fees and travel and food expenses and gear expenses associated with these sports, organized sports, it's just not comparable anymore.
So now you use three different categories to sort of illustrate how the sharing economy would impact the problem, and you identify them as used gear, ride sharing, and coaching. So let's start with the used gear. How would a community go about making sure that some of the people who don't have access to the brand new stuff can find that marketplace, especially in sports like hockey where there's a lot of gear involved, football, maybe not so much in baseball and soccer, but certainly in hockey, football, even lacrosse for that matter?
Sure. So I think the sharing economy has a really interesting vehicle of connecting people because technology is becoming, more and more widely used and pretty cheap in a lot of cases. And so it's really allowing people to connect within a community. And I think the sports community and the youth sports community is already something that's pretty strong, that people trust in and people value. And it's going to connect them in a more streamlined way to, share these assets and services and skills and even their time. So I think around this idea of technology, here at Near Me, we develop marketplaces that connect people around kind of these 4 Ps. And so that's people, projects, products, and places. So the gear marketplace would kind of fall under that products P. So kind of thinking it as eBay or Etsy, where people are listing, their lightly used gear. Maybe their kid grew out of those shoulder pads and that helmet, but it's still very new, and it would connect people to be able to access those lightly used products and for a fraction of the cost.
Is there any quality control that we'd need to be worried about? Don't mean to think like a lawyer all the time, but unfortunately that's what I do. Is there any way to control quality and make sure that, lightly used really is that? At some point in time after taking a pounding, the shoulder pads or the helmet, some of the other equipment might not necessarily be as good as it was supposed to be. How do we factor quality control into it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm always welcoming critiques of my thought processes, and I think that's a very valid point. And I think, with a lot of these new companies coming out, these new business models and regulation not really being established for them, they've had to get creative, and they've had to, kind of think outside the box and implement strategies of quality control, implement strategies of background checks and ways to build trust and safety. And I think this is kind of a really uncharted territory, and I think that there's a lot of room for new ways of integrating that quality control and cost-effective ways. And I think that's definitely a necessity for safety equipment, not probably necessarily like gloves and cleats and maybe baseball bats, but of course helmets, of course pads, and that's going to be a big need in that realm.
I want to remind everybody you're listening to HWTP Sports Talk Radio with David Weinstein. I'm in the middle of a very interesting conversation with CJ Todd about the sharing economy in youth sports. Now, we'd love to hear from you, so post your questions on our Twitter and Facebook pages at #AskHWTPSports. You can email us at feedback@hwtpsportstalk.com, or you can call us at 347-989-0227. Now, CJ, one of the other things you talked about was ride sharing. Is that the same thing as what we used to refer to as carpooling, or is it something a little bit different?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned the gear and the transportation parts because people are already kind of doing that, you know.
Right.
The gear share, you got the hand-me-downs, you know, maybe passed down, from the oldest kid to the middle kid to the youngest kid, and people are carpooling, and I think how we kind of define ride sharing in the overall sharing economy model with Uber and Lyft is those are money making businesses. Those are not necessarily sharing of an asset or sharing of a service, whereas soccer moms carpooling, they're taking the whole team, and I'm sure there's some kick downs, every once in a while, but I don't think it's as money making of a scheme as companies like Uber and Lyft. But I think those behaviors are already there, and I think that that's really important when you're kind of changing an economic model or ways of consumption, is getting people to reframe those behaviors. But if they're already there, I think it would be really easily integrated into their routine.
And I think you're right. I think it's all part of making it part of the routine, using, as we all do, either social media or connectivity to sort of find out, who's in the area, who's going to be able to pick up or transport, not necessarily on an everyday ride-sharing basis, but that if you could go somewhere and something could be integrated in either an app or messaging service or something else, not unlike Uber, that, we've got a game here or a practice here, who's coming this particular route, and it'd be a way to get the kids who either have to rely on public transportation to get there or who simply are the product of a household where neither parent can get them to the practice on time, and that's the one missing link. You've talked about the used gear, and this is the way to actually get them to where they need to be so they can engage in the sport.
Sure, and I think this kind of idea or model transcends, maybe Billy and Joe from the same soccer team riding together, but, for youth sports and even into high school sports where there's probably multiple games of multiple sports being played in the same area, you can coordinate, a football team and maybe, a basketball team and picking up those kids that might not be able to have access to a ride and getting them there, which is half the battle, I think. It's just making the actual game accessible to them.
Well, as you pointed out, it's a lot cheaper to buy one video game, and then the kid sits inside the house, and the only thing that gets any exercise are his thumbs and, maybe one or two other digits, whereby if you could put this together and find a way to get him out of the house and onto the field, you get a little fresh air, you get a little exercise, and you work on those other factors that are part of sporting events and part of being part of a team and teamwork. So it's certainly a way to get them, as you said, out of the house and to the game. The last area you talked about was coaching. Now, when I hear coaching, I just simply think about the men and the women who are out there, teaching the kids every day, helping them with the plays, helping them, figure out what's going to happen during the course of the game and running the practices. But there are other types of coaches who are involved, and in the competitive youth sports leagues, there's a lot of private coaching. Is that what you're talking about?
I think this can be applicable to both ideas of coaching, because I've had plenty of times, as a peewee football player where coach gets sick and someone's dad that doesn't really know anything about football has to kind of oversee the game. And, what if there was an app that, there might be a freelance guy that maybe paying $20 and he comes out and he has a lot of experience and kind of can coach you through that. And I think what it would be more valuable for, honestly, is the private coaching, and this this kind of coaching aspect of this marketplace idea would really benefit from sponsors, and I think it's so hard, especially within the sport industry. That industry is not really that ripe for disruption. It would have been disrupted already, but I think if, like I said before, we can use models and behaviors that have already been integrated into professional sports or even private partners. You can supplement the cost of the coaches with sponsorships, and then offer the coaches services to the kids for free.
Maybe slap a couple of stickers on the cars that they're ride sharing. We can get some little promos going on there as well. Are there any
Definitely.
examples of how this is already in place around the U.S.? Are there some communities where this model's been put into practice where we could see how it's been working, or is this something that's still in its rather infancy stage and really needs a push to get its start somewhere?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason why I chose to elaborate on gear, coaching, and transportation was because there's already an example for us to kind of build off of. And the gear aspect I have a really intimate relationship with, because working for Stokeshare, I kind of see how this is working at the youth level. So Stokeshare is a peer-to-peer marketplace for people to exchange their action sports equipment. So stuff like surfboards and kayaks and tents and skis and snowboards. And what happens is we also partner with youth nonprofits, and we use the gear listed on our site to get those kids from disadvantaged communities outdoors. And then we leverage our community of users and our community of partners to be the volunteers for that. And then we teach them about some environmental education, and we do a cleanup of that wild place that we're playing in. And our One Watershed initiative is really meant to teach kids that everything they do has an effect downstream. So it's a very innovative way of having a business model that makes money, but also a business model that affects the space that we're working in a really positive way and kind of leaving the world better than we found it. And I think the way that we work with youth can really easily be integrated into mainstream sports, and even farther to just focus on, the interaction with the youngsters.
Is there any way that we can encourage either independent communities or colleges to help solve this problem? I have to think that some of the big universities go through just a ton of sporting equipment, and that stuff, they're signing contracts with, you've got Under Armour, you've got Nike, and there's a lot of recyclables that come out of there. I realize that those are going to be maybe a size too big for, your average kid, but there are a lot of high school players who, could use some of that same equipment. Is there any way that we can encourage colleges and communities to get on the wagon and be a part of this?
Absolutely. I think, you make a really great point. I think the community level is where we can really start to make changes and see really positive effects. And I don't know if we think of colleges really as, that amateur sports team, even from the JC level all the way up to four-year universities. They can really be heroes and positive influences in kids' life in the communities and affect their, behaviors positively. And I think, that if they, they already kind of have community events where, they might have a kids club at the game where they're, got tees set up at a baseball game, or youth camps where they, make the athletes kind of lead a camp or, donate their time to develop the youth in the community. And I think that if you can pair those things with these sharing initiatives, and, how cool would it be if, one kid gets a foul ball, but like every kid gets sent home with a glove that came to a game. Like that would change some kids' lives for sure.
Well, and as long as we got them to then sort of pay it forward and, not just make it their own, but when they outgrow it, when they've gone ahead and made use of it, if they could pass it on to the kid who's coming up behind them so they could experience some of the same things that they've been able to experience with this sharing economy. Well, CJ, I think it's a fantastic idea. I hope that the people who are listening will try and implement this in their communities. I know that you're out in the West Coast where people are perhaps a little more progressive than the rest of us, but I think it's an idea worth watching, and I think it's an idea worth exploring, and we can't thank you enough for bringing it to our attention and helping to share this with everybody who's listening.
Yeah, it was a really great opportunity. I'm really glad to be able to join you.
Well, we appreciate it. Keep us updated. Let us know how things are developing. We'd love to have you back in a while to see if some communities have picked up this idea, if you've had any changes to your theories. So make sure that you stay in touch with us. So if people want to look at StokeShare, it's just stokeshare.com is where they'd go?
Yep, stokeshare.com. You can follow StokeShare on all the social media platforms.
Very good. Well, thank you, CJ. We appreciate you coming on, and have a good evening.
All right, my friend. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye now. Well, that's all we have for you this week, sports fans. As a reminder, Huddlin with the Pros Sports Talk Radio airs live every Wednesday evening at 9 p.m. Eastern. We're the talk show that tackles all the controversial, hot-button issues from the world of sports. Recognized by our guests and listeners for our no-holds-barred, good questions, and informed conversation. The show is produced by Jacqueline Park and is a Hyacinth Communications production. Now be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can follow or download our podcasts on your smart devices at blogtalkradio.com/HWTP Sports Talk. A special thanks to our guest, CJ Todd. You can follow CJ on Twitter at CJ_Todd1. Thank you as well to our digital editor, Thomas Joe, and the rest of the Huddlin' with the Pros team. Be sure to join us next week. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you next week.